Ladies and gentlemen, something unbelievable is happening.
Wait, that's Ethan Brooks.
In 8 seconds,
Ladies and gentlemen, meet my husband and successful man in this room.
Sometimes, the quietest man in the
The crystal chandeliers sparkled above more than 300 guests. Chicago's most influential business leaders, millionaires, politicians, and television reporters filled the grand ballroom. At the center table, Olivia Carter gently tapped her champagne glass. "I'd like everyone to meet my husband." She smiled, but there was no warmth in her eyes. "This is Ethan Brooks. My biggest mistake. And probably the only unsuccessful man in this room." Laughter spread across the ballroom. Several executives smirked. Someone actually applauded the joke. Ethan lowered his eyes. He had grown used to humiliation. Olivia continued, "I built my career." He built excuses. More laughter. Then, a chair scraped loudly across the marble floor. Every conversation stopped. At the head table, an 80-year-old chairman slowly rose to his feet. His voice echoed through the silent ballroom. "Young lady, if you truly believe that man is a failure, then every person in this room has been applauding the wrong hero." The chairman turned toward Ethan. His eyes filled with respect. "Because 15 years ago, that man quietly sacrificed everything to save my life." The ballroom froze. Olivia's smile disappeared. And for the first time that evening, the entire room realized the man they had laughed at was the only person the chairman was willing to stand for. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Chicago shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers. Round tables draped in white silk stretched across the hall. More than 300 guests filled the room. Those real estate developers, state senators, television journalists, philanthropists, and some of the wealthiest families in Illinois. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Luxury and success surrounded every corner. Yet, one man looked completely out of place. Ethan Brooks adjusted the sleeves of his 5-year-old navy suit. The fabric had faded. The cuffs were worn. He had polished the same black shoes 3 times that afternoon, hoping nobody would notice their age. His wife certainly had. Olivia Carter Brooks walked several steps ahead of him. She wore a custom emerald evening gown worth more than Ethan's monthly salary. Diamond earrings sparkled beneath her perfectly styled hair. She never once looked back to see if he was following. As they approached their reserved table, Olivia leaned closer. Her smile never reached her eyes. "Please, tonight, don't embarrass me." Ethan forced a small smile. "I'll try not to." She looked at his suit again. "You already are." Without another word, she walked away to greet several executives she recognized. Ethan quietly pulled out his chair. Nobody acknowledged him. 3 years earlier, things had been different. Ethan had owned a respected architectural design studio. It wasn't famous. It wasn't worth millions. But it had earned an honest reputation. Then, a devastating downtown fire destroyed one of his largest construction projects. Insurance companies refused payment. Clients canceled contracts. Banks demanded immediate repayment. Within 8 months, everything disappeared. The business, his office, his savings, even his confidence. Olivia's career, however, kept rising. She became vice president of corporate development at Sterling Urban Holdings, one of Chicago's fastest-growing real estate companies. Every promotion created a little more distance between them. Every award ceremony, every newspaper interview, every executive dinner, Ethan became less of a husband and more of an inconvenience. Back inside the ballroom, a waiter poured sparkling water into Ethan's glass. Across the table, executives discussed billion-dollar acquisitions, luxury hotels, private aircraft, international investments. Ethan remained silent, not because he had nothing to say, because nobody asked. One executive finally noticed him. "And what do you do, Ethan?" Before Ethan could answer, Olivia laughed lightly. "Oh, he's taking some time to figure life out." The table chuckled politely. Another executive smiled. So you're between opportunities? Olivia shrugged. That's a generous way to describe it. More laughter followed. Ethan simply looked down at his untouched dinner plate. Across the ballroom, a distinguished elderly gentleman quietly entered through a private side entrance. Only a handful of people noticed. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His posture remained remarkably straight despite his age. He carried a simple wooden cane. Not because he needed it, because it reminded him of someone. Security staff immediately stood aside. Senior executives rose respectfully. Without fanfare, without announcement, he took his seat at the chairman's table. His name was Charles Whitaker, Chairman Emeritus of Whitaker Global Foundation, one of America's most respected business leaders. For over 50 years, he had quietly donated billions to hospitals, veterans, universities, and disaster relief programs. Unlike most wealthy men, Charles disliked attention. He preferred watching people before speaking to them. His eyes slowly moved across the ballroom. Then, they stopped on Ethan. For a brief moment, recognition appeared in the old man's face. But he said nothing. Meanwhile, Olivia stood near the stage speaking with television reporters. One reporter smiled. We'd love a quick interview before dinner begins. Of course. The camera light switched on. Ms. Brooks, you're considered one of Chicago's fastest-rising executives. What's been the biggest reason behind your success? Olivia smiled confidently. I've always believed success comes from surrounding yourself with ambitious people. The reporter laughed. And your husband? Has he been part of that journey? Olivia hesitated only a second, then smiled again. Inspiration comes in many forms. Sometimes, you learn just as much from someone's failures as you do from another person's success. The nearby guests laughed quietly. The reporter smiled awkwardly. Ethan heard every word, but remained where he was, silent. Dinner service began. Elegant dishes arrived one after another. Roasted salmon, prime filet, imported wine. Conversations grew louder. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Then, the event host walked onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, before tonight's charity auction, we'd like to invite several distinguished guests to briefly introduce their spouses. Polite applause followed. One by one, couples stood. They praised each other's accomplishments, shared funny stories, thanked one another. The atmosphere felt warm. Then, the microphone reached Olivia. She gracefully walked onto the stage. She smiled confidently toward the audience, then looked directly at Ethan. For a moment, he hoped, just hoped, she might finally say something kind. Instead, she lifted her champagne glass. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you all to meet my husband. The ballroom became quiet. This, she said, pointing toward Ethan, is Ethan Brooks. My biggest mistake. And probably the only unsuccessful man in this entire room. The audience gasped. Some people laughed. Others looked away in embarrassment. Ethan remained seated, completely still, completely silent. At that exact moment, far across the ballroom, Chairman Charles Whitaker slowly placed his wine glass onto the table and began pushing his chair backward. The laughter slowly faded. An uncomfortable silence settled across the ballroom. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others whispered behind raised wine glasses. Ethan remained seated. His hands rested quietly on the edge of the table. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. After years of humiliation, silence had become easier than explaining. Olivia smiled confidently, believing the room was on her side. I've spent years climbing the corporate ladder. I refused to let failure define my life. She glanced toward Ethan. Unfortunately, not everyone shares that determination. A few executives laughed again. Then, a loud scrape echoed across the marble floor. Every head turned. At the chairman's table, Charles Whitaker slowly stood. The 80-year-old businessman rarely spoke at public events. When he did, people listened. The ballroom became completely silent. Charles picked up his walking cane, not to support himself, but simply because he always carried it. He looked directly at Olivia. "Young lady," his calm voice carried through the room. "If you truly believe that man is a failure, then every person in this ballroom has misunderstood what success really looks like." No one moved. Television cameras immediately turned toward him. Olivia's confident smile began to disappear. She forced a polite laugh. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm sure you misunderstood." Charles ignored her. Instead, he slowly walked toward Ethan. Every step echoed through the silent ballroom. He stopped beside Ethan's chair. For several seconds, the old chairman simply looked at him. Then, he extended his hand. Ethan looked surprised. After a brief hesitation, he stood. The two men shook hands. Charles smiled warmly. "It's been 15 years. Ethan blinked. "You remember me?" The chairman chuckled softly. "A man never forgets the person who gave him a second chance at life." Whispers spread across the ballroom. People looked at one another. Nobody understood. One reporter quietly whispered, "Do they know each other?" Charles turned toward the audience. "I think everyone here deserves to hear a story." 15 years earlier, Chicago had been buried beneath one of the worst snowstorms in decades. Traffic stopped. Emergency vehicles struggled to move. Charles Whitaker had been returning from a university fundraiser. His driver lost control on an icy bridge. The limousine slammed into a concrete barrier. The impact crushed the front of the vehicle. Fuel leaked across the frozen highway. Within seconds, smoke began pouring from beneath the hood. Drivers slowed, looked, then kept moving. Everyone feared the explosion, except one young man, 28-year-old Ethan Brooks. At that time, he was just a junior architect driving home from a construction site. Without thinking, he pulled onto the shoulder, ignored everyone shouting at him to stay back, ran directly toward the burning limousine. He smashed the driver's window with a roadside emergency hammer, pulled the unconscious driver to safety, then crawled back inside. Charles had been trapped beneath twisted metal. His seatbelt wouldn't release. Smoke filled the cabin. Flames spread beneath the engine. A state trooper screamed, "Get out! It's going to explode!" Ethan ignored him. Using both hands, he bent the damaged buckle just enough to free Charles, then dragged the elderly man across the icy road, only seconds before the vehicle exploded behind them. Back in the ballroom, nobody spoke. Several guests stared at Ethan with disbelief. Charles continued, "When I woke up in the hospital, I asked to meet the young man who saved me, but he was already gone." Ethan smiled awkwardly. "I had work the next morning." Soft laughter spread through the room. This time, not mocking laughter, respectful laughter. Charles looked around the ballroom. "Do you know what he asked me for?" Someone quietly answered, "Money." Charles smiled. "Not $1. He refused every reward. He refused every television interview. He refused every newspaper headline. He simply said, "If you really want to thank me, help someone else when they need it." The ballroom became silent again. Several guests slowly lowered their heads. Olivia stood frozen beside the stage. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. One television reporter quickly asked, "Mr. Whitaker, is that why you invited Mr. Brooks tonight?" Charles nodded. "I've spent 15 years trying to find him. I finally did." The reporter looked confused. "Then why didn't anyone know?" Charles smiled. "Because he asked me never to tell anyone." Every camera immediately focused on Ethan. He looked completely uncomfortable. "I didn't save him to become famous. I just did what anyone should have done." Charles gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "No," he said quietly. "Most people wouldn't have." Then he slowly turned toward Olivia. His expression remained calm, but his voice became firmer. "You introduced your husband as the biggest failure in this room." He paused. "I've spent 50 years meeting presidents, billionaires, generals, and world leaders. Then he looked directly into Olivia's eyes. I can honestly say, the man standing beside me has more character than many of them combined. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause, a standing ovation. Everyone stood. Everyone, except Olivia. She remained frozen beside the stage, watching the room give her husband the respect she had spent years taking away. The applause refused to stop. It rolled through the ballroom like a wave. Executives who had ignored Ethan only minutes earlier now stood with genuine respect. Television cameras stayed locked on him. Reporters hurried toward the stage. Olivia remained frozen. For the first time in her career, she had no words. Charles Whitaker gently raised his hand. The applause slowly faded. I have one more thing to say. The ballroom became silent once again. Charles looked toward the event organizers. Could someone bring me the black portfolio from my table? An assistant hurried over and handed him a leather folder. Charles opened it carefully. Inside rested several documents. He removed one and held it up. 15 years ago, I promised myself that if I ever found Ethan Brooks, I would keep a promise he never knew I made. The audience leaned forward. Charles smiled at Ethan. You refused money. You refused recognition. So I waited. I wanted to help you. Only when you truly needed it. He handed the document to Ethan. Ethan looked down. His expression changed instantly. This can't be real. Charles nodded. It is. A reporter stepped closer. What is it, Mr. Brooks? Ethan struggled to speak. It's the deed to my architectural studio. The room fell silent. Charles looked at the audience. 3 years ago, when Ethan's business collapsed, I quietly purchased the building before the bank auctioned it. I also bought every outstanding business loan connected to his company. Gasps echoed across the ballroom. I never collected a single dollar. I simply waited for the right moment to return everything. Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with tears. You did all this? Charles smiled warmly. No, you earned it 15 years ago. Olivia covered her mouth. She remembered the day Ethan had lost his studio. She remembered telling him, it's over. Move on. She had never known. Someone had been protecting his dream all along. Charles turned toward the audience. There's something else. He removed another envelope. Beginning next month, Whitaker Global Foundation will launch a national program. It will provide interest-free funding to small business owners who refuse to give up after failure. He paused. And the person leading that program will be Ethan Brooks. The ballroom erupted into applause once again. Every camera flashed. Reporters surrounded Ethan. One journalist asked, Mr. Brooks, how does it feel knowing your life is about to change overnight? Ethan smiled quietly. My life changed. The moment someone believed in me, when I had stopped believing in myself. Charles placed a proud hand on Ethan's shoulder. That answer is exactly why you deserve this opportunity. Across the ballroom, Olivia watched in silence. For years, she had measured success by titles, luxury, and public recognition. Tonight, she realized the room admired none of those things. They admired the quiet man, who had asked for nothing, expected nothing, yet had earned the respect of the only person whose opinion truly mattered. And for the first time, Olivia understood. She hadn't married a failure. She had failed to recognize the extraordinary man standing beside her. The ballroom slowly returned to normal. But nothing felt the same anymore. People who had ignored Ethan all evening now waited patiently to shake his hand. Business leaders introduced themselves. Young entrepreneurs thanked him for his story. Television reporters asked for interviews. Ethan politely declined everyone. I appreciate it, but tonight isn't about me. Charles Whitaker smiled. It still hasn't changed you. Ethan laughed softly. I don't think success is supposed to. Across the room, Olivia stood alone near one of the tall ballroom windows. The city lights reflected in the glass. For the first time in years, nobody surrounded her. No executives, no reporters, no admirers, only silence. She replayed every moment of their marriage. The nights Ethan stayed awake helping her prepare presentations. The weekends he drove her to networking events. The promotions he celebrated before his own business collapsed. He had never asked for credit, only understanding, and she had mistaken his humility for weakness. She quietly walked toward him. "Ethan." He turned. His expression wasn't angry. It was simply calm. "I owe you an apology. You owe yourself honesty first." She lowered her eyes. "I spent years chasing successful people, and I never realized the strongest person in my life was already standing beside me." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan smiled gently. "I forgive you." Relief filled her eyes. She took one hopeful step forward. "Can we start over?" Ethan looked at Charles, then back at Olivia. "I can forgive the past, but trust." He paused. "Trust isn't rebuilt with words. It's rebuilt with time." Olivia slowly nodded. "I understand." For the first time, she accepted an answer that wasn't the one she wanted. 8 months later, Chicago Business Journal published a cover story. From failure to founder of Second Chances. Ethan Brooks had become the executive director of the Whitaker Second Chance Initiative. Thousands of struggling small business owners had already received interest-free funding. More importantly, each applicant also received experienced mentors. Because Ethan believed money solved problems, but guidance changed lives. His old architectural studio reopened. This time, part of the building became a free design academy for students who couldn't afford tuition. The walls displayed one simple sentence: "Character outlasts success." Visitors often stopped to read it. Charles Whitaker visited the studio every Friday afternoon. The two men shared coffee, talked about architecture, talked about life. One afternoon Charles smiled. "You know, I spent 15 years trying to repay one act of courage." Ethan shook his head. "You never owed me anything." Charles laughed. "Perhaps, but you've given thousands of people something I never could." "What?" "Hope." Across town, Olivia quietly volunteered at one of the initiative's community workshops. Not because anyone asked her to, because she finally understood that leadership wasn't measured by applause, but by service. She and Ethan remained respectful, friendly, patient. Some relationships couldn't be repaired overnight, but both had become better people because of what they had learned. Months later, a young entrepreneur asked Ethan during an interview, "What was the greatest moment of your life?" The reporter expected him to mention the standing ovation, the foundation, or rebuilding his business. Instead, Ethan smiled. "It wasn't the night an entire ballroom stood for me. It was the moment one man reminded me that your worth is never determined by the loudest voice in the room. It's determined by the quiet choices you make." When no one is watching, the interviewer lowered his microphone. For a moment, the room was silent, because everyone listening understood. The greatest victory Ethan Brooks had ever achieved wasn't proving his wife wrong. It was proving that kindness, integrity, and quiet character will always outlive public success. The end.